and also for the opportunity to connect with all of you. So we'll be speaking today about Knowledge Mobilization 101. My name's Stephanie Warner. I'm the manager of the Knowledge Engagement team. We're a unit within Research Services at the University of Calgary, and we support a number of different things. We'll talk a little bit more about what knowledge engagement is in our opening slides. I've been with the University of Calgary since 2014 and in this role with the Knowledge Engagement team for 2 years now. And Sorel.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, and I joined the Knowledge Engagement team just under a year ago. It's going to be here on Friday. So I'm going to celebrate a little bit. And before joining KE, I worked at a handful of nonprofits around the city, and then also spent some time on the East Coast at a research lab looking at gender and politics.
And my background's actually in cell biology, and then I came to this role by way of spending some time as a career advisor for PhD students and loving things like teaching and science communication when I was a graduate student and a postdoc, and now just really love this idea of connecting information with the audiences that can benefit from it. So I'm just going to move a couple of things on my screen here so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. So in terms of our agenda today, we'll do some introductions and definitions, talk a bit about knowledge mobilization planning and writing your knowledge mobilization plan, and then a bit more emphasis on knowledge mobilization planning with partners. So we just wanted to start off today with a very simple poll. If you are able to access this, you should see it on your screen. How would you rate your understanding of knowledge mobilization? And question 2 is, why are you interested in knowledge mobilization planning and strategy? And that one's an open text box, so you can give us a few keywords of what interests you. We'll just give it about 30 seconds there. And maybe about another 10 seconds. Last chance, and I'll close the poll. And closing. So we have a few folks that are pretty confident and comfortable with knowledge mobilization planning and strategy. And let me just look at a couple of these details here of, oh, this is the thing with Zoom. So Zoom is pointing me into my online Zoom in order to see your responses. So if there were things that you put in the knowledge mobilization planning and strategy text box that you would like us to see, please include those in the chat. My apologies. My default browser is not where I'm logged in. So we thought we would start with a definition of knowledge engagement. It's a made in Calgary term, and we like to define it at the get-go. This definition was created back in 2013, so the knowledge engagement term has been around for quite some time. And it's defined at the University of Calgary as a dynamic and reciprocal process in which multiple parties come together to address mutually identified problems. The purpose of this deliberate engagement is for the co-creation, synthesis, and application of knowledge and evidence to benefit the community at large. And we're really emphasizing words here around kind of knowledge and research, as well as coming together within the university, as well as with other sectors, with that kind of co-creation and deliberation. So what does our team actually do? We deliver strategies, resources, and programming to support these collaborative efforts, really focusing on research impact or knowledge with impact and benefit to the community. Part of Sorel's role is research partnership matchmaking between the university and community organizations and supporting those partnerships, as well as knowledge mobilization planning support. And we'll send these slides out afterwards, so you will have access to any links. We also do some work in responsible and inclusive research assessment, so how academics move through the ranks and are assessed. Our team supports looking at more responsible and inclusive practices in line with the Declaration on Research Assessment. And we're working towards an institutional open science strategy or open research strategy. So a lot of what our team does is really focusing on how is knowledge created, shared, collaboratively generated, and how can it have impact to the communities that can benefit from it. When we talk about knowledge mobilization, we use a definition currently from Research Impact Canada, where knowledge mobilization is about getting the right information to the right people in the right format at the right time. So these can be activities and outputs that build awareness, disseminate findings, and enable the use of research. And when we talk about impact, we talk about maximizing impact or benefit. We're being quite deliberate in our definition of impact as the kind of a longer term change to thinking or behaviors. A lot of times when we think of impact, people will focus on the outputs. So those are really the preliminary set of short-term results, things like, your publications, your data sets, your reports. Those aren't quite impact yet, but they're along the pathway to impact. Next might come outcomes, activities that are undertaken as a result of these new insights. So this could be the uptake or use of findings. We say research findings because we're focused on research impact, but this could be other types of findings as well. Things like new policies. Whereas impacts are those longer term effects that take the form of changed thinking or behavior. So this could be influence on practice, on health, on societal outcomes. So things like outcomes may be intended or unintended, foreseen or unforeseen, direct or indirect. And we're trying to increase understanding by the public. So things like influence on policy and practice. You could look at this as, what have you created? So what? Well, how is it being used? And then the now what? What difference does this make? I'll hand it over to Sorel for our next section.
Thanks, Stephanie. So as Steph mentioned, we often work in sort of the SHRC or the social sciences and humanities research world. And so the way that they like to differentiate between these two different kinds of knowledge mobilization is end of project, also kind of known as the end of the grant, say if your project is linked to a grants timeline, or integrated. So the first is usually once research or any other kind of existing knowledge collection has been completed, and it focuses on that dissemination or those traditional models of communication, whereas the other one is integrated. So it engages partners throughout the entire process. You're working with community or with other invested parties in order to mobilize that knowledge throughout, or it also focuses on collaborative and participatory approaches. Can we go to the next one? Thank you. So this is another way of thinking about that, those two options. We have something known as the knowledge mobilization spectrum. And here it's really highly simplified. So it arranges knowledge mobilization again from dissemination to that co-creation and co-production. And we'll be looking at different approaches and activities over the next few minutes. So I won't go into too much detail here, but I really want to emphasize that the approach of your knowledge mobilization should be determined by what makes the most sense for your project and for the people that you're working with. It's determined by your partners, their preferences, and the particulars of your research, and of course, the resources that you're working with. Thanks. So we're going to start by identifying who those partners are and whether it's a target audience or someone who's working with you a little bit more hands-on throughout the whole process. This is really the first step to an effective knowledge mobilization plan. And the simple way to start is really by brainstorming all of your potential knowledge users and then breaking those down into different groups as you go. So the example we like to talk about is, say you wanted to work with young children and learn about their use of digital tools. You might start by identifying those audiences as parents, as educators, as community groups. And from there, you can start to get more specific. So are those groups preschools? Are you working with daycares or parts of public libraries, for example? And here's where I like to put that equity standpoint as well. So it might be a good time to think about who's being left out. Are there partners or audiences who are underrepresented in this kind of engagement? Are there communities that would be impacted that don't have the same kind of access to these digital tools? Stuff. Prioritize, and then last but not least, those actors and influencers. I think if you can go one ahead. One more. Thank you. So the actors and influencers, as it says on the slide, it might be decision makers, gatekeepers, brokers. But again, I'd really encourage folks to not only focus on those parties because they're often people who can create change. They can help in creating that systemic level of change, but they're not necessarily people who are left out of those conversations traditionally. Okay. So here are some examples of target audiences. We can pull these from SHRC because that's an area that we work in quite closely, but I would say it's a really great starting point for that brainstorming piece. We've got other researchers, policymakers, business leaders, community groups. The one that I point to, again, is the general public. It's so broad that it can be really difficult to target a plan to everybody. So if possible, I would avoid this one or try to think about how you might make it a little bit more specific. Is it a geographic range? Is it an age group? Something along those lines. But I wanted to ask folks, we'll give you about 30 seconds again. Do you know of folks that you would be working with or potential target audiences that you have in mind that are missing from this list? Who's your target audience? The chat. Faith leaders is a great one. Yeah.
I'm seeing youth and frontline staff, students.
Yeah, I think of faith leaders and sometimes frontline staff, depending on what kind of engagement you're conducting. It's being really great brokers as well into different kinds of communities. So if you don't have existing relationships with certain groups or certain folks, who might be the entry point into building relationships with them? Great. All right, let's keep going. Oh, parent advisory committees. Thank you. All right, so understanding your partners and target audiences. So here we're going to spend a few slides. We'll be showing the steps of knowledge mobilization as if it was a linear process, but really it's not. It's quite messy and sometimes it's circular and iterative. It's also quite complex or opportunistic. So you'll notice that there's moments in time where you see opportunities to take on a certain kind of work that you might not have planned for in the beginning, and that's okay. You want to make the most of those moments. So we'd start by considering what you know about the audience that you're working with. How do they like to get their information? What kind of experiences are they looking for? So you might think of a research report if you're talking to an ED at a local nonprofit, but if you want to work with youth, say, a 3-minute YouTube video might be a better kind of approach. It's important to consider the messenger as well as the message. Does your audience have a trusted source of information, kind of like that broker that I mentioned earlier? For an academic audience, peer-reviewed journals and conferences, those are often the things that we see when we're looking at knowledge mobilization plans here on campus. But non-academic audiences, this might look like professional associations, traditional media outlets, community leaders, even families and friends. So to some extent, the approach that you take will be determined by the resources that are available. What's your budget for knowledge mobilization and how much time can you dedicate to these activities? And also, do your partners have budget? Do they have resources? Do they have a physical space? Do they have things that they might be interested in contributing to these plans? And then we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the benefits of mobilizing knowledge with partners. So how you're doing it collaboratively can really increase the impacts in the long term. So we've got a few points here about combining practice-based knowledge and lived experience with the research knowledge, increasing the end user and partner engagement throughout. You have more access to unique skills, expertise, and networks than you would if you're doing it by yourself. And then, like I mentioned, increased likelihood of impact outside of academic circles. So again, I like to ask folks, like, are there other kinds of benefits to working in partnership with your target audience or with the community that you're working with that you think is missing from here? I'm sure there's lots, so.
We've covered everything perfectly is what I'm taking from this response.
Okay.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Incredibly thorough.
Exactly. If at any time something comes up, you are welcome to use that Google Doc or the chat, and we're happy to kind of interact with you that way. So when we think about going from, we've mapped out who our invested parties, our potential audiences, or our key knowledge users might be, we tend to then think of how much involvement those partners or audiences actually want to have. So we're using a good old-fashioned onion diagram or wheel of involvement to show the varying levels of involvement that different parties might like to have, working from the outer or largest circle, and then as more kind of general or more interested, all the way down to a more core central working group. So this is very similar to the spectrum that Sorel showed earlier, but different people want different functions from knowledge mobilization. So as we move from the least involved stakeholders, pardon me, I'm trying not to use the word stakeholders, it's still in my notes, I'll cut that out. Move from the least involved parties to the core working group, different activities become suitable. So, for example, in the interested category, you might have folks that want to be informed of the work in progress, but not directly involved. So something like, a newsletter, social media, or an infographic might work well. In the supportive space, those folks might want to provide limited support and input. So they might want to answer surveys or attend a community forum. Those folks that are more involved might be consulted more frequently or provide in-depth feedback. And that might look like things such as focus groups or a steering committee. And the core is really your central working team or partners. So it's important to consider that decision-making and authority are correspondingly distributed to this wheel of involvement. Those in the interested circle might not even have structured opportunities to provide feedback, but those in the involved circle have considerable influence over decisions, but the ultimate authority, we would say, resides within that core working group. So if that core working group includes partners, the project could be seen as co-producing knowledge. So that would be more of that systems function of knowledge mobilization, which is really looking at co-creation. In addition to the preferences for involvement, thinking about the level of engagement as determined by the capacity of the project team. So really, even if folks are really wanting to be more involved, but the core team is not open to it, then you're really limited to that lower level of engagement or involvement. So for example, the inform level might be best used when you're communicating a decision or a course of action or existing knowledge. It might be that a process is starting and more engagement is possible later on, but it's not ideal for seeking discussion or partners who would prefer more active involvement. When we move into consult, we might say that this is best used when potential changes to a project are limited, but feedback will be used to choose between options, for example. Not ideal for empowering partners or generating discussion among the partners. Whereas involve might be that the experiences and skills of your partners or your audiences are helpful for planning and doing the work, or they strongly want to be involved. But you're really limited if your project doesn't have space for actually implementing those suggestions, or if the partners don't actually have capacity to carry out a particular proposal. And the collaborate or empower, we're really looking at mutual benefit and being open to mutual benefit when there's sufficient time and resources and when there's a commitment from both sides to working in partnership. So this isn't great if projects are really short on time and you're trying to build these partnerships and you're trying to deliver very, very quickly. It's possible, but it can be difficult to build trust and engagement in that time. And partners with only more superficial or short-term interest in working together. So really that most engaged level is really looking at if you're both committed and interested in and would benefit from working together. And partners should really only be consulted involved when there is an opportunity to meaningfully incorporate their feedback. So before we look at knowledge mobilization activities in a more specific sense, we'd like to do something that people tend to find a little bit fun. So maybe if that's where you want to take your chat, but can you think of the most effective ways to immobilize knowledge? How do you immobilize knowledge? What practices or methods could you use? And if you can share something in the chat, that's a great way to make sure knowledge is never going to be mobilized. Yep. So we're seeing in the chat big technical terms, only publishing your results behind a paywall. One example we use is, really simplistic. You never leave your office. You really focus only on doing the work, and you really don't think too much about knowledge mobilization. Are there any other ways you can immobilize your knowledge? Maybe directing your message at people who aren't interested or couldn't benefit from it. So maybe like directing it at a very broad audience so people can't find it, for example. Blame a user group in the messaging. Yes, negative messaging and blame definitely goes a long way to alienating folks, making them not feel empowered or involved. Absolutely. Condescending, talking down to folks really specifically, emphasizing that you know best and that that can work in some senses if you're building trust in your knowledge, but condescending message is not so great. Not making it relevant to the community that it's about. Absolutely. Sometimes we might see going really far down a path of knowledge mobilization before even considering what that community might be interested in or whether this is a problem that they are interested in solving. Absolutely. So we do tend to think about what not to do in order to help you think about what to do. So we're talking more here about the types of knowledge mobilization activities, but I think flipping some of those what not to do or ways to immobilize knowledge are a great way to think about what is a better practice. So there's a lot of different options for effective knowledge mobilization. And when you're deciding what activities to include in your knowledge mobilization plans, some kind of menu or kind of options can come in handy. So we will share a resource package afterwards that includes a document like a knowledge mobilization menu. In the broadest of terms, you can slice and dice knowledge mobilization activities and practices and outputs in a ton of different ways. But here's some examples that we have thought up in terms of on paper, online, or in person. So things like a journal article or a report or a magazine or news article, an infographic or a policy brief. I think some of the on paper versus online is still a bit of a holdover from pre-pandemic times where anything that could be on paper could certainly also be online. So it's kind of an interesting distinction here. We could also think about something like a blog post or a massively open online course, which is a MOOC, a podcast, a webinar, a video, many other different kind of options in here. And in person, things like a conference, a lunch and learn, a trade show, a workshop, a town hall, a focus group, perhaps, even kind of showing up to events that others are hosting and having just that physical presence can be a great option for knowledge mobilization. So you really want to think about the supports and resources that are available to you through your networks, your organization, your partners. It may be that one of your partners already has a well-subscribed monthly newsletter that you can leverage. Maybe there's some graphic design expertise that's available to help create a compelling infographic, for example. What are some other examples of creative knowledge mobilization activities? Are there any that, this is a pretty limited list, but if there's any in the chat that you'd like to share, we can have a look at those or mention them and share them out with folks after the fact. Youth-led forum, social media campaign, an art display, TikTok, yes, absolutely. Amazing. So once you've started to schedule out your activities or select some potential activities even, you do need to think about when you're going to do them and what resources will be required in order to do them well and effectively. So the integrated and end of grant activities might happen at different points in your project's development. So you do need to keep your approach in mind. And if you're trying to kind of layer things one on top of the other, it can be a lot more effective. So your strategy can balance like the single point in time with some of those ongoing activities or relationships or channels of information, and balancing some of the more active activities with more passive activities. So in some cases, creating a website and having that available, that might be seen at one point as like active creation, but then it might be a bit more passive where people can go there and can engage with it and it can be updated. Whereas if you're going to an event, that might be a bit more active. The one really important point is that a lot of these activities, they take time and they take energy and they may take money or resources or budget in order to actually do these well. So this can include making sure that you're planning for events, including things that might be, printing costs for handouts. It might even be, do you need to reimburse parking or offer child minding, food or light refreshments? Things that where you're able to consider accessibility of your audiences. And you really want to look at what's eligible if you are, asking for funds through a grant, for example. You really want to look at eligible costs carefully and ethics considerations if appropriate. So in terms of how you can compensate participants or audiences, you want to keep in mind what is eligible for funds, and really keeping that kind of equity lens on it as well as to who is able to participate and who might not be. And in terms of considering the sustainability of initiatives, if your knowledge mobilization plan is dependent on some temporary funding or resources, it can be really helpful to think in advance how you might keep some or all of the activities going when the resource runs out. Is there a way to leverage ongoing relationships? Can you distribute the work enough that it's manageable in the absence of funds or a decrease in funds? Can this work be rolled into other initiatives that could be funded in different ways in the future? And really being intentional about that. We've definitely seen circumstances where a group has, they're very planned and budgeted activities. And then there's a discussion at the end of grant as to whether aspects of this will be distributed out and go into a more side of the desk community of practice type of thing. Or if there's opportunities for, smaller pots of funding, for example, to keep some personnel going. So just the really realistic aspects of knowledge mobilization. Ideally, I mean, you'd have a standing item if you're an organization. You may have a standing item. If you're more project-based, you may be looking at this more kind of ebb and flow of resources. And the final element of a solid knowledge mobilization plan that we do want to mention is the evaluation portion. At its simplest, each of your activities should include an indicator or two of success. And success might be a function of the community space and measured at the level of the knowledge users. This means not just focusing on how many outputs you generated, but how is it used or taken up or engaged with by the user. Those indicators should be defined up front as much as possible, and you should build in methods for gathering this information from your knowledge users. So for example, this could be a range of different kind of engagement levels, but it could be metrics of newsletter opens versus surveys on the usefulness of the information or actual conversations with knowledge users about how this information might have changed their practice or their beliefs, for example. Don't shy away from assigning accountability for evaluation and reporting. For example, if you want to plan to include social media, perhaps specify who on your team will be responsible for managing the accounts, planning content, and managing the evaluation. And you do want to try and weave your evaluation through all stages of your knowledge mobilization plan. So waiting till the end means a lot of retrospective data collection, which can be very hard to find, as we all know. So planning ahead for that can just make everyone's lives easier and allows you to tell a really great story about the effectiveness of that knowledge mobilization plan, and hopefully tell some stories of the impact that you've had. One tool we did want to mention is the Knowledge Engagement Impact Assessment Toolkit. And this is a two-part toolkit that our team developed in collaboration and through funding with from Research Impact Canada and the Future Skills Centre. And it's how to assess your activities against some principles of reciprocity, externalities, or the reach, access to the outputs or to spaces, and the partnerships and strategic context of your activities. So what this actually helps you to do is kind of tell the story of that impact. And through using a matrix, it's an Excel sheet that has a weighted assessment of these different indicators. And then it also has a guided portrait for how to create a story of those knowledge engagement activities. It can be used at the planning, monitoring, or impact assessment stages, and it does come with a user guide. And if you have questions about it, you can always reach out to our team. Sorel has pasted the link in the chat, but if you visit ucalgary.ca/ke-toolkit, and the link will be in your slide, have a look at that and see if it's something that might be beneficial for supporting your evaluation plans. All right, back to Sorel.
Thanks again, Steph. We're on time. I'm proud of us today. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about actually writing your knowledge mobilization plan. How do you include all of these pieces that we've covered in kind of a succinct way, especially if you're putting this together for, say, some of your teammates or a funding application or something along those lines. So once you've determined your target audience, you've decided the approach, you've selected some activities, you've determined how you're going to evaluate your success, and you have to put it all together. And this is kind of an outline that we'd recommend to get started. It's a good idea to start with something like an attention-grabbing first sentence. I like to think about those high school social studies classes and writing a lead for a newspaper article. From there, you can focus on 3 to 5 activities that really clearly link your knowledge mobilization to the overall goals of your project. And do be explicit about the audience or the audiences for each activity and why it's appropriate for that group. Here you can also include things like specific indicators associated with the reach or the evaluation methods. So this is where we sometimes see examples from folks where there's a bit of a disconnect between who they want to talk to, their overall goal in the long run, and then the kinds of activities and the timelines that they pick. And so we just want to have a really clear line that links all these things together. If you are writing this in the context of a grant, you might have to be strategic about word counts. We've all been there. Highlight those key audiences, activities, and goals, and then you can demonstrate that you have a larger plan where you have more involved details to the reviewers. We also wanted to share just, especially for long-term projects, your knowledge mobilization plan can include details on how it will evolve to meet the needs of your partners over time. So especially if you're working closely with community groups or different organizations, and something like a pandemic happens, your plan is going to have to change. And so you can make space for that early on in your plans as well. And then we have an example. So of course, we're kind of in research services. We have a lot of research focused kind of examples to share, but I'll spend some time just covering this and then we can talk about it in detail. So this was a research report. They said they wanted to write a report to share with their target audiences. And this was an example. At the end of year 2, the project lead will submit an article to the Teachers Magazine. The article will combine storytelling with a high-quality infographic to present findings in a compelling way. The article is timed for publication shortly after the launch of a website, and it will include a link and description. The magazine has an audience of over 40,000 subscribers, largely educational professionals. Digital back issues of the magazine become freely available on the publisher's website. So you can see from this example how it makes the audience really explicit. It talks about the appropriateness of the method selected. It assigns accountability for the activity, and it includes some key metrics for reach and success, all in just a couple sentences. Here it also talks about the layering of activities like Stephanie had mentioned. So they're using an article as an opportunity to direct knowledge to a website. And then there's also a storytelling and infographic piece. So they've woven in some different activities throughout. And then I just wanted to share this as kind of a summary of all the strong examples and some weak examples of what to include in a knowledge mobilization plan. How do you know if your plan is a strong one? We want it to balance both that end of grant or end of project dissemination with some engagement throughout the project. It demonstrates the understanding of the impact. It articulates what the team will do. So again, accountability, goals and objectives, and an evaluation framework. And then some examples of what might be found in a weaker plan. It only focuses on dissemination. So in that case, it's more of like a communications potentially plan. It conflates the outputs with the impacts. There's a literature review about knowledge translation, but there aren't any links to the activities. It's unfocused. The list of activities and audience and objectives aren't really connected. And then there's no evaluation plan or no nod to what those indicators are going to be.
I'd also throw in the kitchen sink approach too. Sometimes we see plans that are like, we are going to do everything with every audience, but they are not able to kind of define who those key audiences are and the level of priority. And that can seem quite disorganized. So I think that unfocused list of activities, it really can be beneficial to choose a few key avenues and discuss them in more detail. And I think that's helpful for us as well to not feel overwhelmed by trying to do everything as the knowledge mobilizer or as the knowledge broker. We can focus on what's really important to our key audiences or partners.
Yeah, and that's kind of the nod to general public as your target audience. If you're going to try and talk to everybody about a particular issue, that might be like a national campaign, say. That's quite an undertaking. It's not necessarily as focused, and it could dilute some of your impacts at the end of the day. So that one always makes me hesitate when I see it at the top of an application. We wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about planning with partners. We're going to show you just a few quick slides because we want to leave lots of time for questions and conversation at the end. But we'll start with our partnership principles. Awesome. So this is something that we spend more time on when we're talking to researchers about the benefits, again, of working in collaboration with community or with different kinds of partners in general. And these are some of the principles that we try to really encourage and focus on. So is the project mutually beneficial? What about the methods, the outcomes, the entire process could strengthen the research and also meet the needs of the community that you're working with? Is it reciprocal? So how does this relationship build capacity for, again, yourself and for the community partners that you're working with? Is it a shared and ethical space? Is knowledge co-created? So when we're working with a research kind of environment, just really reiterating that there are different kinds of knowledge and they're equally valuable. Collaborative partnership development. So is this more of a formal relationship? How are all the parties going to be involved? Do you need to lay things out in sort of a contract or an MOU? And then, of course, exchange of knowledge. So recognizing and respecting all forms of expertise. So this stemmed out of a Carnegie Community Engagement Classification project from the University of Calgary a couple of years ago, but it's something that we continually refer to in our practice here. And then last but not least, we have this process that we share when we're talking about integrating knowledge mobilization throughout. So the steps, as you can see, you're connecting with community partners. I'm guessing from a lot of folks in the room today, you already have those connections and those relationships well established. You want to set aside an appropriate amount of time and resources to build trust, to develop those relationships, and then you're planning this together. Execution and communication of mobilization of those research findings. This one I find is kind of funny that we've put it in a bubble on its own because we talk a lot about it being integrated throughout. But then we also want to ensure that we've maintained enough time to maintain the relationship and have it be sustainable in the long run. And again, I would say this is kind of a really clean cycle that we've shown here, but it's never this straightforward. It's never really kind of one following the other this cleanly or this nicely. So what integration looks like will really depend on the skills and the interests of the groups that you're working with. And then we want to talk a little bit about relationship readiness. So oftentimes, as Stephanie sort of hinted to, we'll see folks that have an entire project kind of in mind. They've outlined their methodology. They have an idea of what mobilization will look like, but they haven't really connected with those partners yet. So talk to them early, talk to them often. Really key here is sort of trying to understand what are both the outputs and the impacts that they're interested in seeing at the end of the day that will be most useful to them and most practical, say, and integrating that into your entire process as you go. Does the relationship require that formal agreement or contract or an MOU? If you're connected to the University of Calgary, we can help you navigate some of this. We've got other units in RSO that can help put this on paper. Some key terms to be aware of are intellectual property, who's owning the data at the end of the day. We're learning more and more all the time about OCAP principles, which is specific to Indigenous-based research. And there's quite well-articulated guidelines on how you would navigate the ownership of data in those circles. Confidentiality, of course, is important. Publication outputs, timelines, resources for knowledge mobilization activities, all things that you want to think about in those early stages again. What am I missing here? Okay, grab most of it. Yeah, and so depending on the project, your partners might want the right to review prior to publication. So again, you don't want that to be a surprise at the end of the day. And partners can potentially delay things like publication. But yes, we're happy to help you sort of navigate the other kinds of supports that can work through these together.
Amazing. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll step back in. So we'll just wrap up with kind of the closing statement of knowledge mobilization can happen at any stage of a research project. We've focused a lot on the co-creation and the connecting with, audiences and partners early. And we do see a lot of benefits from that. We also recognize that's not always feasible. So knowledge mobilization can take different forms, and just being intentional and honest and reflective about why you're choosing the activities that you're choosing can be really helpful. Plans should be feasible and resourced, just to make your likelihood of success much higher. And the strong knowledge mobilization plans are really intentionally linking the audience to the activity, to the expected outcomes and impacts. And that shared ownership and leadership can ultimately increase the success of your knowledge mobilization plan. If you're connecting early and you're incorporating in what different audiences are interested in, what they care about, what matters to them, it is more likely that you're going to have more kind of uptake and diffusion of that information within communities as well, and folks sharing it with each other. So some of the takeaway resources that we'll provide, so we will send a slide deck, and PrevNet has kindly translated those into French already. We'll share some knowledge mobilization planning resources, and we also invite you to visit our website. We do have a knowledge mobilization planning page, and we have the knowledge engagement impact assessment toolkit linked from that page as well. So maybe we'll leave this. We do have some upcoming webinars and such. So the Navigating Partnered Research webinar series, that is also linked from our website. And if you are curious about working in partnership with the University of Calgary researcher, you're welcome to book a consult with us. And these links will be live on your slides. So we'll leave it there and open it up for questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to connect with you all.